Hello, everyone. I'm Errol, and I am joining you from the southwest of the UK in a city called Bristol. I am really excited to talk about design mentoring and open source as a design opportunity with you at Remote Design Week. It's a topic that I'm super passionate about, a little bit extra nerdy about. So I'm so pleased to talk about this with you today, and I hope that you find it interesting and exciting as much as I do. So without any further delay, I will head into the talk. So design mentoring and open source as a design opportunity. So this is a lot about my journey as a designer for humanitarian open source software and some of the pathways that designers can take to start in open source and why I really think it's worth you investigating and doing that. Here's a little bit about me if you're curious about my background. So, as I said, my name is Errol. My pronouns are they, them. I've been doing design for quite a while now, 11 years, maybe even a little bit longer. And I've mostly been in digital product design and user experience. The kinds of sectors that I've worked in my past are around insurance and finance and student services. But I also have this passion and always have done alongside my professional career as a designer in NGOs and third sector work and charity work, and now the humanitarian and human rights sector. So I've actually been doing stuff within the humanitarian and NGO sector for about 8 years. Some of that is voluntary, and then now it's more in a work capacity. I'm a little less experienced within open source software. Don't tell too many people, but it's been about 4 years since I got interested in open source software. And as well as working, I'm also a PhD doctoral trainee. I'm looking at how designers contribute to open source humanitarian and human rights software at Newcastle University's Open Labs. So, a lot of what I do is related to this topic of open source software and humanitarian work and human rights, as well as being a designer. The title I like to give myself is an interesting one that we can always talk more about in chat, in questions afterwards. I call myself a human rights centered designer, and it's a really interesting title, and we can delve more into that at a later date. So, I want to tell you where I do my work now alongside my PhD. So, I work at an organization called Simply Secure, and it's a design nonprofit. So, we work on design projects primarily, and it's based in Berlin and New York. They were founded in 2014, but I joined recently. I joined in the last 2 months, actually. Although I have been doing work with Simply Secure on a volunteer basis and within their community for about 2 years now. We do the design and support for responsible technology that enables human dignity. So we're talking about the kinds of software, the kinds of technology tools that are open and privacy and security minded, and privacy and security as a human right. The products and tools that are decentralized, ones that work across transparency and human rights needs. And we also work with other nonprofits in and around the technology space. However, one of the places that I used to work that I'll be talking a lot about within this talk's content is an organization called Ushahidi. So Ushahidi is a fantastic, amazing organization that I still have a lot of love for and do a lot of work with. They were founded in 2007, 2008 in Kenya by some technologists who, at the time, were observing some of what was going on in country around the first democratic elections in Kenya. And what was happening was a lot of people, citizens, and other people that had the right to vote, were being violently stopped from voting, or they were being coerced to vote a certain way, and essentially a lot of human rights issues were happening within the country at the time. And the founders wanted to create a tool, create a open tool that was not owned by a government, not owned by an organization, that was owned by the people, to enable them to raise their voice and to talk about the things that they were experiencing as those elections were happening. So that was the history of Ushahidi and why they created one of their first open source tools. But since then, Ushahidi's tools have been used in lots and lots of different ways to empower people across different human rights needs and humanitarian cases. And one of the examples on the screen at the moment is when the Ushahidi data collection tool, which was used during these elections, was used when the earthquake was happening in Nepal. And the information that was collected and submitted by real citizens experiencing the earthquake was actually used to send humanitarian relief aid from the Nepalese army and directly resulted in people's lives being saved. So Ushahidi's story and the kinds of things that they create are really passionate stories about how when we put technology and the design of technology in the hands of the people that use it most and need it most, and enable a process that they can participate in openly, amazing things happen, like lives being saved and people being able to raise their voice against oppression. Another tool that Ushahidi created was a tool called 10.4, which is actually the tool that we used within the project that I'll be talking more about in this talk. 10.4 is one of the tools that actually a common problem that you might find is when you can't get in touch with somebody, you try texting them, you try messaging them on email, and you just can't get a hold of that person. Ushahidi created this tool called 10.4 that aggregates different communication methods into one platform. Because when there was a terrorist attack on a mall in Kenya, we couldn't get in contact with some of our team members that were in the mall when that attack was happening. And we were going through this process of trying to contact them. So Ushahidi really creates these essential tools for survival, for health, and for people being safe. So I was working as a designer at Ushahidi, and one of the questions that I found myself, along with my design colleagues, asking over and over again was, where are the design contributions to open source software? And contributions are another way within open source software of saying work that gets given freely or voluntarily. So I'll be using the word contributions to mean essentially that when we do work on a tool or a service or a software that we really believe in. So we either do that in a way that we can do with our spare time, or collectively when we come together in some of the events that I'll be talking about around the project that goes into how designers contribute to open source more. So there were lots of developers within the projects at Ushahidi, so both paid developers and also lots of developers that contributed code. People that would contribute code regularly, people that would contribute code maybe once every few years, but were still equally as essential as part of the open source contribution ecosystem. But we had so much design work to do within Ushahidi as a team of two that we really believed that we could use and needed the help of open source designers. And we also believed that designers really wanted to be able to contribute to tools like Ushahidi creates. So what we did was we began to investigate this question through creating an initiative that we called Open Design. You can find a version of Open Design on my GitHub link, which is github.com/erroldoesdesign/open design. And Open Design was originally created in collaboration with DesignX, which is a big global design agency, but in particular their German offices in Berlin during the case of Open Design. And what DesignX had done was they had actually approached Ushahidi to do some pro bono work for us. And this is a relatively common occurrence that design agencies and designers and organizations that can offer volunteer hours or contribution hours for their staff in these agencies can access and ask NGOs and charities if they need the design support. And this is exactly what DesignX did. But as we were discussing our thoughts as the designers that worked internally at Ushahidi about the challenges that we faced as designers with an open source and how we really believed that designers could really add so much value to open source software, not just for Ushahidi, but generally, they were really interested in this idea. And they brought along to those conversations Adobe, who were also really up for scoping out this question further and really interested in this question. Partly because at the time within Ushahidi, the design team were using Adobe XD as our tool of choice, and we were producing design work for these open source software tools for human rights and humanitarian needs using Adobe's tools and Adobe's products. And one of the key questions that we talked to Adobe XD team a lot about was how we can do things more openly on these tools. So what was Open Design's aim? So essentially, the aim of Open Design was to facilitate designers collaborating and contributing to humanitarian open source software and tech for good at challenge gatherings. So we tested this out, this hypothesis, this aim, this thing of what we wanted to do as a collaboration between Ushahidi and Adobe and Designer in a couple of pilot events in 2018 and 2019. So we did two, what we called at the time, design jams, where we tested whether bringing together these designers around a common humanitarian purpose through the lens of contributing to open source software tools that we already had at Ushahidi were successful, and what happened, and what kinds of things designers enjoyed, or what kind of things designers learned about open source software, and what kind of benefits the open source software had through engaging with these designers. So we did this public event in Berlin as a standalone event to try and learn more. And it was so successful that we decided to do another in Seattle at an IXDA conference the following year. There is a short video that I can share with you all after this talk about Ushahidi's tools and the event in Berlin and what we did there. But I'd like to talk more now about what we found out from these events and the kinds of things that we discovered about designers that really informed the next phase of the Open Design project. So, something that made Open Design really successful was that it showed that open source software isn't always obtuse and very technical. And certainly not just for developers. And it showed that open source can do good in the world. And it showed this to specifically to designers that really wanted to work on projects for good and contribute their design skills, their knowledge, their understanding of how to make things, products, software, really human-centered and really user-centered in the context of human rights and humanitarian aid. And there was just something really beautifully enriching that the designers that participated in these events got from directly working on improving projects for good. Here is another example from another open source designer that engaged through other open source projects that I've worked on how he has understood open source and designers' involvement within it. So Florian, who worked on a mutual aid open source project with me over 2020 as things were going into lockdown and we needed more mutual aid more than ever and mutual aid in more open ways, says that open source software is part of our daily lives, and especially part of our daily lives as designers using digital services and using the internet and using the web. And open source software deserves the same treatment that non-open source software gets, which is a proper user-centered design process. So there is a real need for designers to be in this space, giving their skills and insight into how we can do user-centered processes within software in open source software. Some of the other things that we discovered about designers within open source is that open source software really isn't part of our education as designers, either informally or formally. So if you do any kind of formal design training, maybe you go to school for design, open source software is rarely included, if at all included, even though, again, you might actually be using open source software within your design education. And it's then something that we just don't learn about and just don't understand as as part of the wider ecosystem of the tools that we engage with and the tools that we use. And this contributes to The second thing that we learn that is connected to the fact that we just don't have the open source software as part of design education even mentioned really often in the learning tools that we have, which is leads on to most designers just not having a clue about what open source software is, or having misconceptions about what it is, being very technical, being very developer orientated, and draws back to that open source software can be things that do good in the world. But most designers just don't understand what, or don't know really what open source software can do. And this really connects into the lack of education on open source software for designers, and how it can be really vital and really enriching to designers' educational processes and education to understand what this could mean, what this could do, and the kinds of things that they could work on if they engage with open source software, especially when they're growing those skills within that learning environment. The extra thing about not having a clue about open source software and what it can be, the broadness of open source software beyond the technical side of things, and it not being part of our education, is that if those parts aren't fulfilled, if we're not being taught about open source software and not being shown that it is a valid, useful, enriching part of how you can do better design within a real life project scenario, it means that when we're putting these projects on our CVs, or when we're communicating to employers, when we're ready to move into the jobs market, that we've been working on open source software as part of our design practice, it's not as well understood by the people in agencies, in companies, in organizations. So it's not seen as like a viable source for developing design skills until we start to build it into our educational system, until we start to value designers' place within open source software. So we really need to build the foundations of the educational practice within open source software and engage with it more, so that it can be something that is super valued by the design industry more widely. Something that might have crossed your mind as I've been talking about open source software and technical things and these kinds of aspects of working within this space is that we found that even if designers know about open source software, that GitHub and related things to do with GitHub and working on software can really be a barrier to entry. So things like GitHub send this message that it's a place for developers, it's only for developers or people that have that kind of coding knowledge. But it's really a space that can be utilized by designers in really important ways, and it should be a place where designers are welcomed. And more we see organizations like GitHub and other tech tech stacks or tech organizations that are there to support developers beginning to implement things within their tool suite that enable designers to do better work in the open as well. So the second thing about GitHub and it being a barrier is that if we're not including open source software within our educational processes, we're not then learning how to use GitHub, and we're not getting comfortable with these kinds of processes and feeling like it is a space that we can occupy, that we have value to add, because we do. And it's just about this impression that GitHub has as like only a place for developers, when it's so useful and so amazing when you see designers begin to engage with open source software through GitHub as the main vehicle to participate. So GitHub really needs to up its game still to include designers within its feature set, but it's getting there and it's getting better. And I really encourage any designer to take a look at GitHub and not be afraid of creating a profile there and checking out some of the projects that are in existence on GitHub and starting to contribute to them. So we learned all of these different things. That's just a sample of the things that we learned from designers about how they view open source software and how they participate in it, and some of the challenges that we wanted to try and overcome in the next phase of the Open Design project. So I want to talk a little bit now about how we did the second phase of the Open Design project and how we began to solve some of these problems, or solve some of these challenges that designers were having when they tried to participate in the open source software world. So we took the original open design events, and we took them to two different new locations. And we used the 10-4 tool, which I talked about a little bit earlier, the communication tool, into the southwest of India in Bangalore and also into Taipei in Taiwan, to really focus in on the two humanitarian crises that those two areas have commonly had over the last couple of years before the pandemic. In the southwest of India, it was floods that were happening in that area, and in Taipei and Taiwan, it was typhoons that were devastating farmers' properties and crops. So we wanted to take open design to these new locations, and we wanted to solve some of these problems of how to engage the designers within the open source tooling and how to better serve, how to bring open source better into the design space as well. One of the first ways that we did that was by making sure that we had design activities that most designers knew how to participate in and knew how to engage with, essentially, within the open source software. So we wanted to make sure that we used certain design activities to really build team cohesion between the designers that have entered into into these events in these new locations. And it wasn't particularly about fancy or complicated ways of doing these design activities. On screen at the moment, there are things like empathy maps and ideation and storyboarding and then doing prototyping. But really, it was about these kinds of design activities being so groundbreaking and new for open source software that the way that any designers can participate in these, even early career designers, designers learning their craft, right through to designers that have been doing these kinds of activities for tens of years, the participation and the contribution of these artifacts for open source software is so valuable for it. So hugely beneficial to open source software, like nothing they've ever seen before. So we made sure that we did these design activities and we contributed those through coming together in groups and working on a specific issue or a specific challenge in relation to the 10-4 humanitarian open source software tool. And we made sure that the teams together worked on these activities and contributed them to the open source software at the end of the gatherings, at the end of the events. But I mentioned something there called issues and design challenges. So one of the things that was really tricky and we learned in the first phase of the open design project was that to do with designers not quite understanding or not knowing how to participate in the existing ecosystem of GitHub and how things are even expressed and worded in GitHub around these open source softwares. So one of the new activities that we introduced in the second phase that you all can participate in if you're curious and want to start contributing design to open source software is a method of translating what is called an issue to a design challenge. So we took these issues, which are often worded in very kind of developer-centric language, very technical speak, and we started from a basis of, as a user, I want to be able to do this, this, and this. And we wanted to make sure that we included designers in how those needs can be solved from a very user-centered perspective. So you can find the templates and some examples of how to translate issues into design challenges on the link on the screen at the moment. We can drop those in notes and in chat rooms if you're curious and want that link to check out. But one of the things around translating issues to design challenges that is really apparent in open source software that is also really challenging to designers is that there is a desire often to offer a solution to a problem through the writing of an issue. And one of the main challenges that designers faced when they needed to translate these issues into design challenges was not be solutions focused and be focused on the user-centered problem space and exploring the problem within the context of the specific kind of technical requirements that were already existing in the issue. So when we did this exercise, it was such a beautiful balance, seeing the designers take the technical speak that a lot of open source software often uses and balancing it out to be very user-centered in its language, and actually open up that exploration into different kinds of ways of solving the problem than the open source software initially thought. The second part of open design that we improved was how we built a design community. So, because design in open source is relatively new, and our processes and communities generally outside of the open design community and the open design program that we delivered, they're not really structured particularly proficiently at the moment, and we're not really socialized in the same way as designers as developers are, and we needed the design community feel, the collaboration feeling of how designers participate on these really complex solutions, or these really complex problems, like how do we help farmers after their buildings are devastated by typhoons? How do we help them manage how to ask for volunteer help, and how do we manage how they can send out further signals when there are other ramifications or other effects of the typhoons that have happened afterwards, and the same with the floods. So we don't want designers to work on these problems in isolation, because they're so important and they're so big in a lot of ways, that really, by creating a sense of design community around these issues, making sure that people work in teams around these challenges, it was so super important to build into the second phase of the open design project. And I really encourage you, as designers potentially interested in participating in open source software, that you really take a design community approach to solving some of these open source challenges and engaging with open source through design contributions. The last thing that we changed within the second phase of open design was that we explicitly invited witnesses into the process of creating great design for these design challenges. So one of the things that open source software doesn't often get is access to their users, access to people that really have that lived experience of the use case of the open source software tool. But one of the things that designers do fantastically well, especially if you're a UX researcher, a user testing professional, or you work with face to face with users all the time, is that you're really proficient in engaging with the users of the tools. So we wanted to make sure that we invited in these witnesses, so that firstly, the open source software could get that experience of how designers engage with the people that use their tools, and the designers could also get the benefit of hearing firsthand from the people that have experienced typhoons, have experienced floods, and the wide variety of things that happen there, that they could ask those questions like, is my design idea, the way that we've approached this challenge, is it viable from your perspective, having lived through this experience? So not only did the open source software get to experience how designers work with users through this new addition to the open design project, but the designers got to access the wealth of knowledge that these people have through their experience of some of these intense humanitarian crises. Again, there's a link on screen at the moment, which we can make sure that you have access to if you want to take a look at how we engaged with witnesses. So we wanted to call them witnesses instead of users for some very important humanitarian and human rights reasons. And it worked really well. So just to close out this topic, you might be wondering, okay, well, you did this open design project. It sounds pretty cool. You tried some things out, some things worked, and these other challenges are here, and these other experiences that designers might have when they're going into open source might still be true, and they are still true. So why should I engage with open source software? Why should I contribute? So there are lots of different reasons why you should, and why you could, and why it's a great way to engage with a topic that you really care about. If you're interested in humanitarian crises, there's open source software for that. If you're interested in any kind of human rights related issue, I guarantee you there will be open source software that tries to solve for some of those problems. So if you're a designer that's always wanted to work on a problem that you feel really passionate about, there will be open source software that will be trying to solve that problem that you can participate in. But one of the key things is that you might be having this experience maybe when you're trying to build your portfolio as an early career designer, but we often fill our portfolios with these kinds of like vanity projects, with the kinds of projects that are ones that we've created ourselves, that we've written briefs for, or maybe that's one or two people have maybe asked us for. But I see a lot of portfolios from designers that have these kinds of projects that aren't alive, essentially. So they exist within the portfolio only. And I think it's really sad when there are so many open source software projects out there that are alive and they're living, and that you can, as a designer, fill your portfolio with living open projects that are visible for many, many years to come. And collaborate with all of these designers and developers and other kinds of people from across the globe on these really critical problems. So, to wrap up, I want to make sure that you have access to the open methodology from the Open Design Project. This is an open project. You can take this open design project, and if you think that something could do with improving, the great thing about open source and open projects is you can make that change, and you can request that change be merged and included within the next version of open design. So that's one of the beautiful things about open source, is that we can so actively participate in it as designers. So the access to the open methodology and frameworks and all the different processes that you can remix is on my GitHub at erroldoesdesign/open design. And if you're looking for a more community focused way of getting involved with open source before you start to dive into projects, I really recommend the community of opensourcedesign.net. So this is an amazing community of supportive designers having conversations about what it's like to be a designer in open source, and also talking about lots of different projects that you can get involved in. There's a jobs page on opensourcedesign.net that is for both contribution jobs, so ones that you contribute design to, but also sometimes some paid gigs on there as well. But more importantly, it's about building this community of supportive designers within open source and learning from each other, and really making this impact in this much needed area of software, which is open source. So thank you very much for listening to me today and learning all about design in open source.